From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Jason Staples bringing you Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, this podcast brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price, and by Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, by Shenandoah Realty in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and by Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. If you need a mortgage, give him a holler. Compare him to all of the other options. Talk to him. Talk to other options. You need to shop. You need to make sure you're getting the best, not only the best rate, but the best experience. I'll stand behind Justin on this. Give him a holler. You'll be glad you did. Let him know you heard about him from the Unconquered podcast. Okay. After a pretty busy week of several podcasts breaking down the Georgia Tech debacle and the not so great start to the season that Florida State has had, it's time to preview game number 2, and that is the Boston College Eagles, who are visiting Tallahassee for the home opener. And, you know, there's a sort of symbolism in the fact that Florida State is rebuilding this year after the run last year, and Doak Campbell Stadium is rebuilding right now. There's a major stadium renovation, about which I'm pretty ambivalent. I mean, it should result in, you know, better amenities and, you know, significantly more money and functionality in certain respects moving forward. But I also really don't like that it probably makes the stadium maybe a little bit less loud. I will say I would prefer to see them put in some significant awnings, you know, some Autzen Stadium style awnings or whatever, anything that they can do to continue to hold that sound and make the stadium louder, and encourage people to be in the stadium making that noise during games would be, you know, I'm all for that. So, yeah, so we'll see how that actually goes, but it's going to be interesting playing in front of half a stadium. You know, it still should be, as Mike Norvell said, still should be pretty rowdy given Florida State fans, but definitely a different experience than what this team has seen in the last couple of years. Okay, that being said, what really matters is not the soft stuff. You know, that soft stuff, you know, the soft factors, those things affect, you know, games on the margin to some degree. But what really impacts things is, you know, how teams play, whether they're prepared, all of those things. And matchups. So let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to start with looking at Boston College's offense against Florida State's defense. So, you know, Florida State opened the season against the best rush offense in the ACC last year, and an offense that in our preview we talked about. Look, they're dangerous. They've got one of the best offensive lines in the ACC, one of the best that Florida State's going to play. You know, maybe on the same tier actually as Notre Dame and Miami, but basically Notre Dame, Miami, you could probably put Boston College and maybe Clemson in those groups as far as the best offensive lines that Florida State's going to face this year. I don't think Clemson's is as good as what we saw from Georgia Tech, but anyway, they managed to live up to their billing. You know, returned all those guys on the offensive line, returned their backs, returned quarterback, returned all those pieces, and then managed to handle their business and do what they needed to do against Florida State, who couldn't adequately stop the running game in that game. And, you know, Florida State not physical enough for much of that game. So we've talked that one to death. But now Florida State faces the number 2 rushing offense in the ACC from last year, which also returns a bunch of the pieces that made it the number 2 rushing offense in the conference last year. Most notably, the combination of 4 returnees on the offensive line, a very good running quarterback in Thomas Castellanos, and then Robichaux, the big back that they had last year. And then they're adding Trayshawn Ward, who we all know about, very good back as a secondary back. So, Robichaux's about 220 pounds. Ward, as we know, is a smaller back, but excellent vision, really tough to stop. So look, they're going to be a challenge in the running game. Now, they did lose their best offensive lineman last year. Christian Mahogany went in the 6th round last year, and Mahogany actually was a guy that really gave Florida State's defensive tackles, which was a really good group. He blocked those guys last year. And in general, the Boston College interior was able to handle Florida State's defensive tackles pretty well last year. And, that was one of the reasons that game wound up being as close as it was in the end, although Florida State had jumped out to an early lead. And really, that game didn't feel like it was a game that Florida State was going to lose, but it became a game where they could have lost it. And, by the end. And one of the reasons for that was that basically they were able to block Florida State's front. And frankly, Florida State's front last year was better than their front this year in terms of the frontline guys, largely because of two guys, Braden Fisk and Jared Verse, who, are not walking through that door. Now, Florida State still has a really good defensive line, a really good set of bodies. In some respects, more depth on the edge than they had last year, as we've talked about ad nauseum so far this year. So it'll be interesting to see that without Mahogany, who was really good at guard, and then without, Fisk and Verse, and then adding Daryl Jackson and some of the other pieces, it's going to be interesting to see that matchup. To me, that matchup, as much as anything else, is going to determine the outcome of this game. It's pretty straightforward. Can Florida State hold up on the defensive line and at linebacker against what Boston College is going to do in the running game? You stop the run, or slow down the run, limit the running game in this game. I don't think Thomas Castellanos is going to have the arm or the playmakers outside to cause enough problems to beat you. But you're going to have to start by stopping the run. As for that offensive line, like I said, they returned 4 starters. Starting with right tackle Ozzy Trapilo, who's 6'8", like 310 pounds. He's a big boy. And that whole offensive line, is basically between 300 and 325 pounds. They're all good athletes. They do not have a bad player in that group. And that right side in particular, they go, 6'8", 310, 6'6 plus, or 6'7", 325 at guard. And then the center is 6'4", 300. So, they are big. And they, on that right side in particular, you're going to have to be able to match up with size. To me, this is a game where Sione Lolohea probably needs to play more snaps. He needs to be a guy that is out there to help set the edge. And, Lolohea, to me, in this game, needs to play more than somebody like Patrick Payton. Look, Payton is one of your best guys. He's an excellent pass rusher. You got to be able to platoon to your strengths and to the strengths of what the opposing team wants to do. And to me, you got to put some guys out there that are going to cause problems for them in the running game. And you've got to put guys out there that are going to be able to hold up and set that edge and essentially spill things to the outside. Now, Payton is going to do that at a higher level. He should be on the field, maybe about the same amount. But to me, Lolohea needs to play at least as much as Payton and Marvin Jones Jr., just because of his size and what he brings to the table as a run stopping edge setter. Now, there are some question marks on the left side. Mahogany's absence opens that up a little bit. Now, they've got a couple of different fourth year players that are in the mix for that. They've got an or on their depth chart there for that left guard. Both of those guys basically have the size and the length to be a problem for your defensive tackle group. And again, as good as your defensive tackles are, they're going to have to play to what you think they are in this game. And then finally, at the left tackle spot, they've got another guy who he's played some football. He's not been the full-time starter at any point, but he's got a couple. And again, another really, really nice, big body, athletic player at left tackle. Another guy with the potential to play in the NFL. This is a good offensive line. and they're going to have to match up. You're going to have to match up and go to war because they are going to play physical football and they're going to run the football. Now, to me, it's going to be pretty interesting to see what they do in terms of scheme on the offensive side. I've never really been a Bill O'Brien guy. I felt like he was I think he might have been the main reason that Alabama didn't win a title in at least one of the years that he was there. I think he's a guy who has tended to kind of force what he wants on personnel sometimes compared to, maybe adjusting to best accommodate his personnel, but he's got a ton of experience and he knows how to run an offense. And one thing about a Bill O'Brien offense going back to his time at Penn State is it's going to be physical and they are going to run the football. And, one of the questions for me is how much are they going to force Castellanos to try to throw the football in sort of pro style fashion and try to throw the football down the field on, in terms of drop back stuff, play action stuff, or are they going to lean into his strengths? Are they going to basically do a lot of what Boston College did last year once they figured out how to use him last year? And if I'm Bill O'Brien, I'm looking at last year's offensive film and I'm going, yeah, I can do a lot of the same stuff. There's not a whole lot of reason to change what they did in terms of that. You start calling some of the single wing, influence quarterback run packages and all of that they used for Castellanos to gain a gap and essentially force teams to get that extra safety up. And then you allow him to kind of run around and make some plays on the run using his arm to, downfield. And he throws like a baseball player. He's able to throw on the run and make some plays that way. So, that's the other thing. And how much, if you're Florida State, do you look at that and you say, okay, we need to handle Castellanos in specific ways based on what we saw last year versus looking at what O'Brien has done in prior years. There's a lot of scheme questions coming into this game on both sides in terms of Boston College. And in some sense, if I were Mike Norvell, I would really have liked this to be a week 3 game rather than a week 1 game, because this being Boston College's first game, there's just so many points of uncertainty in terms of what you're going to see from them. We'll talk about on the defensive side, but you really don't have a good sense of what they're going to look like in terms of scheme. So you're kind of having to come in here blind, prepping for this game on both sides of the ball. But you do know what the personnel is. So again, Castellanos is going to run around. He's going to make plays. He's slippery and it's going to be a real challenge to get him on the ground. And then you add the 2 backs. And then, they've got a couple receivers that'll give you trouble. Lewis Bond, 5'11" guy who, more of a speed guy. He's going to cause some problems. You're going to have to find ways to make sure that he's covered. And then, they got Kamari Morales, who's a grad transfer at tight end from North Carolina, where he was a little bit more of a pass catcher, not the most physical guy as a blocker. Good enough as a blocker, but not the most physical in the world, but does have very soft hands and can be a problem downfield. Not a taller, longer guy, a little bit on the stubby side. I mean, he's listed at 6'3", but I think he's closer to 6'2" based on what he looked like at North Carolina. And actually he's from Tallahassee, so this is a big game for him. I'm sure he's going to have a lot of family there. So that's where they are. And I look at this, and this is not honestly the best matchup that I would want for Florida State coming off of the last game and looking at where they struggled against Georgia Tech, and then facing this team with this personnel in a game where you really don't have a good sense of how they're going to line up or what they're going to do. And I do kind of expect a little bit of a uneven start, as Boston College is sure to have a very good opening script. I mean, it's your opening script of this season, right? That's usually going to be really good. So they're going to have an opening script, maybe 2 opening scripts. And, the important thing for Florida State is get out of that first quarter, get out of the first couple drives, maybe only give up a field goal there. You can't give up 14 points on those first couple drives. They're going to have to be able to hold up on those first couple drives And then you get to base football. And by that point, you've got a chance to figure out what they want to do, who they are, and where they're going to present problems. And again, I think you kind of scheme in this one based on personnel rather than against, what you might expect them to do in terms of the passing game or whatever. I think you have to come into this and say, okay, what we cannot allow is we cannot allow those running backs and that quarterback to run wild on the ground. So if there's a game where if you're Florida State, you come in, I know Adam Fuller likes to play with a light box and to cover on the back end as a priority. If there's a game to break tendency on that, to me, it's this game. Because the thing that is most different between Boston College and Georgia Tech in terms of offense and offensive personnel and what they bring to the table, it's that Georgia Tech has, as we talked about in our preview and as we saw in that game, they've got some extremely fast playmakers on the outside. I mean, Singleton is a 10-2 guy in the 100 meters, right? They had multiple guys that are 10-6 or better in the 100 meters on that team on the outside. So you've got to honor that in terms of being aware of that problem with your safeties and keeping your safeties. It makes sense against Georgia Tech to actually not go as heavy a box to stop their really good running game. Against Boston College, I think you play coming forward much more and you say, you know what? Castellanos is going to have to beat me with his arm throwing downfield to a set of wide receivers that I don't think can beat my defensive backs one-on-one. And to me, this is a game where you just say, I'm going to play my defensive backs one-on-one. I'm telling my backers to come straight downhill. I'm simplifying what I'm asking my guys to do in terms of gap stuff. And I just need to make sure that we are not out of gaps and that you tackle to the ground when you get the chance. Simple. If they're able to do that, and again, I think this is a game where if I'm Boston College and I like my offensive line, I know what my quarterback can do as a runner and all of that, I'm going unbalanced. I'm putting a sixth offensive lineman on the field at times. I'm doing all sorts of stuff to try to gain an extra gap, use the running back as a lead blocker, do some read option stuff, do all sorts of those things, just trying to make it difficult in terms of eye discipline and all of that on the opposing defense. That's what I'm doing. And for me, on the flip side, if I'm Fuller, I'm saying I'm putting the extra guy in the box this week, and I'm going to try to take away that extra gap that you're trying to create. It's pretty simple. Like I said, it's not the best matchup in the world, though. So, I do expect Boston College to have a little bit of early success against this Florida State defense. Now, last year, they ran the football 41 times for 152 yards, 3.71 yards per carry, which is not, that's not a ton of success, but you're still going for 152 yards and you're still slowing the game down and keeping the game closer as a result. And I think they're going to try to do the same thing. And I think, for Florida State, you keep them at or around or under 4 yards a carry in this one, and you probably win the football game. But, I think that's where things stand. I think we're going to see a comparable type game offensively to what we did through most of last year's game. So I think somewhere in the range in terms of overall yards per play, I think somewhere in the range of what we saw last year is probably to be expected, which they averaged 6.09 yards per play last year because they were able to hit some pass plays once Florida State started committing so much to the run game. They averaged 9.0 yards per attempt in the passing game for 305 yards. That's the other thing. You've got to find a way to limit that while committing to the run. I think this secondary will be able to handle that for the most part. I think that's going to be the primary difference from last year's game to this one defensively. But again, I think it's going to be a tough go. I expect Boston College to, average over 5 yards per play in this game and, score in the neighborhood of 17 to 20 points. Because I think that that first half is going to be really tough for Florida State to kind of get their feet and figure out what Boston College wants to do. And this is a kitchen sink game for Bill O'Brien and Boston College trying to get a marquee win in game one. They're going to bring it. So I think, in the neighborhood of 5 yards per play and 17 to 20 points is about what to expect on this side of the ball. in this game. So Florida State, to me, the magic number for Florida State to win this game, to feel like, okay, how many points do we have to score in order to feel like we're almost certainly going to win the football game? To me, the magic number for Florida State on offense, based on, Georgia Tech's defense, I think if you score 30 points in this game, you win it. I think the magic number is probably 28. So you score 28 or more, and you probably win this football game. And that's kind of how I would be thinking about it coming in. But, it's possible, I think, for the defense to hold them below that. But to me, that's kind of the magic number. That's where you say, okay, score 30, probably walk away a winner. Now, flipping over to the opposite side of the ball, Boston College defensively, again, returns a good portion of their roster. If I remember right, they return, hold on, I got to look this up. They return 8 starters on defense. So again, this is another experienced football team. And that was one of the things where Boston College, or where Georgia Tech, going back to the last game, Georgia Tech was the most experienced team in the ACC in terms of guys who've been on the same roster. That was the most experienced team in the ACC coming back. And Florida State's one of the 3 or 4 most experienced teams in the ACC in terms of total number of starts and snaps and all of that. I think they're second or third. Boston College is again one of those in the top 4. This is a very experienced football team with a lot of starts, a lot of guys who've played a lot of football. So, you're playing against some grown men in this game. And I think one of the things that you're looking at is you're playing against grown men in the trenches. They return 4 starters on the defensive line, all 4. Now, I am very curious, again, what are they going to do in terms of scheme? They hired Tim Lewis, who has coached all over the place, but hasn't coached college football in a long, long time. I mean, I don't know. I'm looking at it now. When was the last time he coached in high school or in college? So let's see. 1992. He was the defensive backs coach for SMU. That was the last time that he coached college football. Now, he's coached in the NFL. He's coached in high school since then. He's coached in a variety of, are these arena teams? I mean, Arlington Renegades, I think that's arena. So he's coached all over. But, he's a guy that has a lot of experience as a defensive coordinator, has coached in a lot of contexts. I'm curious to see what he does. I mean, his background in terms of NFL was Dick LeBeau, going back to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And if you listen to some of the stuff that the Boston College players have talked about during camp and all of that, and they've been kind of coy about what they're doing. They've talked about how they're going to bring more blitzes and there's more movement in general, more stunts, more games. They're going to be more aggressive on some of those things than they were last year. And that does seem to jive with what sort of coaching tree he comes from. The Dick LeBeau coaching tree is all about creating pressure from different looks, moving, lots of different stunts and defensive line movement, lots of zone blitzes from a variety of different looks. They're going to try to cause a lot of uncertainty in terms of who to block on the offensive side, who's going to be dropping where, what guys are going to be in what zones, a lot of disguise, that sort of thing. That's been sort of the calling card for LeBeau type defenses in the NFL. And odds are that's what Lewis is going to be doing at Boston College. Now, in game 1, that usually is a recipe, game 1 of a new scheme, that's usually a recipe for some busts. You might have, a guy that is out of position here or there because there's a lot of complexity defensively. But if you don't have a bunch of busts, if those guys do, and you've got a lot of guys with experience, if you have those guys actually doing their jobs properly, now you're having to identify and deal with a lot of complexity, a lot of exotic stuff. To me, again, I look at this and I say, if I'm on offense, I don't know exactly what to expect in terms of what their preferred blitz looks are. And, you can only bring so many blitzes or games or pressures into any given game. So what are their preferred subsets of, the LeBeau type stuff? I haven't seen all that from them. I don't know. So I'm trying to simplify this for my team early on. And I'm saying, you know what? I'm going to run the football. I'm going to find a way. This is my calling card on this team this year. I'm going to run the football, and I'm going to try to go some play action where I've got some max protect options, and I just need to figure out, okay, I'm going to max protect this, and I'm going to let my speed wide receivers have some deep options, and tell the quarterback to pull the trigger and get those guys basically give them a chance against one-on-one matchups. That's what I'm going to try to do. But we'll see. Because you really don't know what to expect from Lewis and this completely new Georgia Tech defense. You don't know fully what to expect. I think you do have a sense that they're going to be varied up front. They're going to run some odd stuff. They're going to run some even stuff. And the depth chart that they released is even, but it had 2 defensive ends kind of listed as starting edges. But I think you're going to see some variation in terms of how they line up front. They're going to drop some guys. They're going to bring others from the second level, third level, and do a lot of those things. So I look at their defensive line. It's not the biggest defensive line in the world. They've got 2 edges that are 250-ish, and then 1 300-plus pound defensive tackle. The other's about 285. To me, I want to line up and mash that group and force them to tackle big backs and to handle a big offensive line going straight forward. Maybe you don't run counter as much initially. Maybe you run some just straight inside zone just to make it easy. You put your guys on tracks and tell the backs to pick the hole and get forward. That's the sort of thing I'd be looking at. Other thing, by the way, I do expect from Tim Lewis is I do think that he's going to load the box some early on. Hafley was a guy where, he played a lot of man free, a lot of middle of the field close stuff, and did commit to trying to take away the run more than a lot of coaches, and was willing to play some man coverage on the outside, some true man, not just cover 7 style, one-on-one stuff like Florida State typically does. I think you'll see more true zone blitz stuff, some more fire zone, some more, middle of the field open packages, but they'll still load the box some against Florida State in this. And to me, that's where the helmet communication comes in. I would go with a little bit more up-tempo stuff if I'm Florida State on this, to try to get my quarterback to the line of scrimmage and then call it in his helmet based on defensive look right there, run through it. And, if you're at the line of scrimmage with 25 seconds, you say, okay, this is what I've got. This is what I've got. You go through signals, let them show their hand. And then maybe you say, okay, check, run this. To me, I think that might be a better use of the in-helmet stuff. If you can do some of that in this game, speed up the process just a little bit so that you can continue to use that and be in the quarterback's ear, helping him make a couple adjustments and say, okay, check. Let's get out of Indy. Let's get out of inside zone. Let's move to a play action, post climb, thing here. I like the look against the defense, and just have a system to quickly signal that so that you can get the looks that you want. It's going to be tough. It's tough to do that because, again, what they're going to be able to do is to change their defenses as you're doing that. So, who's holding the chalk glass is going to be tricky in these contexts. But I do think personnel wise, I think you can run the football on this Boston College front. I think the size situation up front, I think this is a game that, again, they may be able to get some penetration early. I think, again, this is one of those where they're going to have some looks that you're just not ready for early going. I wouldn't be surprised if in those first couple drives, the defense is holding the chalk last a couple times. But by the end of by the time you get into the second half, I think this is a game where you can start to lean on them and pound them with some of the size and all of that. And to me, that's one of the other things about going a little bit more up tempo on this one. I want this game to be more like 12 drives rather than 7 drives, which is what we saw against Georgia Tech, simply because I want more opportunities to adjust. So the faster you can transition, so some of it's going a little faster on offense. Some of it is if you can just get a couple tackles for loss and stop some of those long drives, which they were not able to do against Georgia Tech. If you can get this to be a 10, 11, 12 drive game, I think second half you're able to start wearing out and wearing down this I keep mixing that up, but you know what I mean. This Boston College roster, and especially that defensive line, which is a group of grown men, but how much can they hold up? How much depth are they going to need against your offensive line and your running game if you can get into the 70, 80 play range instead of in the 50s? To me, that's going to be something that you're trying to go for in this game, or at least it would be if I were Mike Norvell. So last year, Boston College was generally able to limit the run game. Again, Hafley was very good at presenting a lot of different looks while keeping the box stacked, and they gave up 3.76 yards per rush, which was, very good. It's one of the best jobs anybody did against Florida State last year. But ultimately, Jordan Travis was able to do enough in that game. Still only 223 yards passing last year, 15 to 24. I mean, it was a quick game last year. There was not a ton of plays on both sides, and again, it was a relatively low possession game last year. You want to change that this year if you can. But 9.3 yards per attempt last year. I think you can do similar things on the back end this year as long as DJU executes. But I think you've got to run the football better this year than you did last year, and be prepared for those heavy boxes with some other looks in the run game. The other thing that I'm trying to do early is, like I said, I'm trying to get some max protect shot plays early to give DJU some opportunities where it's read this guy and you either go here or you go here, but either way it's a shot and give your guy a chance. I want to give a couple of those chances early on, if at all possible, and throw a little bit on first down to loosen up the defense a little bit more than what they did against Georgia Tech. But I think this is a matchup where it's, sneaky difficult early on, and early in the game, I would expect maybe a little bit of a few hiccups and, kind of looking a little bit frustrating. So putting all that together, last year, the, total output, Florida State averaged 6.05 yards per play. That was enough. They actually, it was one of the few games last year that Florida State actually lost the per play matchup. I think that might have been one of two, if you count I think in the regular season, there were only two games. It might have been the only one last year where FSU lost the per play yardage, matchup. But 6.09 or 6.05 yards per play last year. I think it's, probably around the same. I think, 6 yards a play in this one is about what I would expect. I mean, the personnel is very similar. I think they'll be able to run it a little bit better this year than they did last year. And, I don't think that the per play average in the passing game is likely to be quite as good this year as last year, despite DJU at his prior stop averaging well over 10 yards per attempt. I just don't see quite that level of success in terms of per play in the passing game just yet, given what you're putting out there at wide receiver and DJ's comfort or lack thereof and what you're asking him to do in the passing game against an experienced defense. So all that goes to say, I think this is going to be another game that early on you go into the half, and I wouldn't be surprised if, Boston College was up. Wouldn't be surprised. Now, should they be? No, but given some of the uncertainty, given some of the kitchen sink stuff that they're liable to do, and some of the things that they actually bring to the table with an experienced team, I wouldn't be surprised if this was like 13-10 at the half, Boston College. But I do think that if you can get this to a 10 possession type game, ultimately the depth and adjustments as you figure out what they want to do starts to take over. And I think this is going to be a bit of a war in that respect. And I think this game's going to say a lot about what Florida State is going to be the rest of this year. You expect the biggest improvement usually between game 1 and game 2. And, even though I think Georgia Tech is a better team than Boston College, this is a Boston College team that's equipped to give Florida State a lot of the same problems that they saw in week 1. Now, if you do have a team that's player-led, that's going to be able to do some of the things that you expect them to do in terms of growing over the season, you expect them to be able to come out and play at the level of intensity and discipline and all of that up front, especially to be able to just physically dominate the opponent enough to where you can win by the spread margin in that range in this game. And if they do that, I think that bodes well for the growth potential of this team moving forward. But it's entirely possible, especially given some of the, kitchen sink factors that I mentioned earlier, that, you fall a little bit behind early, you get, give up another play or two, give up a field goal or a touchdown early because of, X, Y, or Z, that if this team doesn't show the leadership that they need, that this is the game that kind of indicates like, okay, this could be a longer year than anybody's expecting. Now, one thing that I will mention as well, Mike Norvell finally kind of discussed how the linebackers that played, the primary backers, the guys that got the most snaps, so that's Omar Graham and DJ Lundy, that they hadn't been available in practice as much down the stretch at the end of camp and through Georgia Tech prep. And in fact, what had gotten to me is that they basically hadn't really practiced in 2 weeks prior to the Georgia Tech game for a couple reasons. Now, my response to that when I was told that was, why were they playing then? Why were those guys the ones that were out there for the most snaps, if that was the case? And it, really boiled down to not entirely trusting the younger guys yet, but I think they should have. And I think they're kind of kicking themselves at this point that they didn't, because those guys played like they hadn't hit in a couple weeks, right? They played like they were still thinking like they were not prepared in the way that they would have been had they been through full prep with scout team and going fuller speed and all of those things at the, in the preparation. So I am very curious to see the difference at the linebacker position in this game, given what we saw in the first one. Okay, so who's going to be out there, first of all, and for how many snaps and where? And then are we going to see a difference in just comfort level and ability to, recognize read keys and trigger in the proper gaps? If that's the case, then all of a sudden this defense might become what we kind of anticipated it would be coming into the year. If it doesn't, then I think you need to see those young guys in the game right away and see them a bunch more. And I expect to see at least 20 in there as a good bit more. I mean, I think Nicholson essentially earned starting level reps in that first game. And I think he's sort of earned your trust to some degree. Again, if I'm Boston College, I'm using some boot throwback stuff to the tight end. I'm using all sorts of misdirection to cause problems for that linebacking crew in particular. But that's going to be kind of a litmus test for this team and for this defense moving forward of how much improvement do you actually see against a team that can cause you problems but really shouldn't beat you? Are they able to bow up and respond and deal with things in a way that suggests that, okay, by the time they get to the meat of the schedule, this team's going to be fine? I mean, the margin for error is gone. I do think, as you start to look at schedules, it gets a lot more difficult from here. I mean, I think Florida State may well need to win out in the ACC to make the ACC title game here. Because if you lose to Clemson probably, if you lose to Clemson, for example, Clemson really has Florida State and Louisville among the real contenders for the conference, plus NC State, who did not impress me in their opening game. So if you lose to Clemson probably is no worse than 2 losses in the ACC. And Florida State would have 2 losses and would lose the tiebreak. Georgia Tech, they got a really tough schedule overall because of Notre Dame and Georgia in non-conference, but they should be favored in every game except for the Louisville and Miami games in conference from here. If they split those two, they go 7-1 in conference, maybe. I mean, they still have UNC and NC State as well. I mean, they do have a tougher slate, but let's say they lose both Louisville and Miami and they've got 2 losses, but if Florida State loses a second one, Georgia Tech holds the tiebreak. Georgia Tech would need to lose 3. And I think that's a pretty good Georgia Tech team, it turns out. Miami has the softest schedule of those groups. I mean, and they seem to manage that all the time. They've only got Louisville and FSU as the real threats on their schedule. And, after what they looked like against Florida, it's a real possibility that Miami, they basically have a 2-game ACC schedule. Now, I know you got to trust in Mario, trust that there will be an opportunity for them to find a loss somewhere else. But, that's a pretty good roster. And with Ward at quarterback, that's a scary team. Right? So, if you're Florida State and you drop the game to Miami, Miami's going to hold Miami, Florida, right? If you drop a game to the Miami of Florida, then they hold the tiebreak over you for ACC. And then you've got to find a way against somebody else. So, and you've got 2 losses in conference, and, it's going to be interesting. The margin for error is gone for sure. But the talent hasn't changed. The capacity to move forward and win, basically win the rest of your at least your conference games on this schedule, still there. But it's going to be really interesting to see where they go. Now, as far as the predictions part of this podcast, I'm going to weigh in now. I'm going to finally get to it. Like I said, I think the defense probably gives up about 5 yards per play. I think it's a very good sign if they give up fewer than 5 yards per play in this game against this roster for Boston College with this new coaching staff, the uncertainty surrounding it. Better than 5 yards per play is an excellent sign moving forward. But I think they give up about 5 yards per play. And I'm still not entirely sold on this defense's capacity to entirely prevent a couple of the big play type busts that Castellanos is really good at producing. So I'm going to say that points wise, that winds up being about 23 points for Boston College. And that's going to put some pressure on this offense again. Going to have to score some points to win this game. Now, again, defense could completely bow up and change that, but that's where I'm expecting things. I think this Boston College team probably finds some stuff early, put some pressure on Florida State's offense. I think on the offensive side, I think they're going to get some things cleaned up and get some things fixed against a defensive front and against an overall defense that I think they're going to be able to find some success on, especially in the second half. I think they'll be able to hit that magic number, but I do think that there's still some work in progress stuff going on. So I'm going to go with 34-23 Florida State in this one, with maybe a late score as the separating thing there, but 34-23 Florida State. I think this is, again, about an 80% chance of 80% likelihood of winning this game. Can't turn it over. You turn it over once or twice more than Boston College does, and they beat you at home. But I'm going to go with that. 34-23 Florida State. We'll have plenty to reevaluate once we get back from watching this on Labor Day night, but I will be there shortly thereafter with the hot takes. Until then, this has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. And thanks also to all those supporters over at Patreon, where I post video analysis and field questions for the podcast. I am especially grateful to those above the dynasty level. That is Andrew Garrett, Brian Leininger, Neil Cook, Casey Kidd, Chris Chartrand, Dave Blair, Hector Cartagena, Jack Horton, Jimmy Van, Jonathan Kennedy, Keith Cheney, Lee Caswell, Tyler Kashishke, Vince Calandra, and Bert Bertoldi. You all are far more generous than I deserve. I'm really grateful. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.